Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're exploring abuse within the Jewish community. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. Just a quick warning to our listeners, because of the nature of this conversation, this subject matter, at times, very briefly, we do use some mature language. So I'm not sure where you're listening to this, whether it's in a carpool or on your way to work, but I wanted to make sure that I let you know that obviously the subject matter is sensitive, and at times we use some mature language. I have a great deal of personal trepidation approaching this subject about abuse within the Jewish community, primarily focused on clergy abuse by religious leaders within our community, and it is a very fraught and scary subject. On the one hand, if it's not discussed properly, you're not really doing justice to the people who have firsthand experienced these types of abuse. People who I know quite personally, incidents that I'm not really at liberty to discuss here openly, but people who I know and I know well who struggle and whose their entire lives have taken a different course because of the abuse that they dealt with. And talking about this subject in an inappropriate way, in a way that's not really grounded, not just in experience, but in the literature and being able to talk about it in a sophisticated way, does not do justice or does not honor the experience of the people who have really suffered from this. On the other hand, I'm not sure if it's an option not to talk about it. It's not an option because the very mission, the very focus of what 1840 was established for, as we've said so many times, is to really confront and discuss points of dissonance within our religious lives. And we've discussed theological dissonance, we've discussed emotional dissonance when you're not getting that sense of satisfaction, but there's also sociological dissonance when the very framework and power within your community does not reflect the type of values that you would hope to see within it. And even with the risk and with everything that is at stake in discussing it improperly, not discussing the way that some would have liked, discussing the way that other people would have liked, because this is a very rightfully so, deeply opinionated subject in the way it should be discussed and the way it should be discussed. Because that is so, it is nearly impossible to speak about in a way that is going to be bullseye perfect. But I have a very specific goal and focus in speaking about it on 1840. Number one, the first goal is to talk about it. This is a point of dissonance for many, many people. How do I know this? It's not just in the Jewish community. The scholar that has influenced my thought the most on this is somebody named Hugh Turpin, which I assume not many people have heard of, and that's absolutely fine. He wrote his PhD, which later became a book called Unholy Catholic Ireland, which is about religious hypocrisy, secular morality, and Irish ex-Catholicism. Essentially, what his book talks about is the larger effect that the way that the Irish community dealt with the scandal of the Catholic Church and how it affected people's religiosity. The reason why he was so instrumental and had such a great effect on myself, and I'll talk about that in a moment, is because more than just focusing on exclusively the primary victims, he really focused on what's known as secondary victims. What does it mean to have a secondary victim? What does it mean to be a primary victim? A primary victim is somebody who was directly affected, the subject of abuse. Secondary victims is a much broader demographic. It may include their families, but in a broader sense, it really includes all of us. It includes adherents to a particular religious denomination, whether it's a church or a synagogue or a school, who have had their faith irrevocably changed because of the way they saw either the crisis itself, the scandal itself, the abuse itself, or the way that the aftermath, the crisis, was handled. And a secondary victim may find themselves asking, why should I trust in anything ever again? Why should I have faith in this system of faith if I've been disappointed, if I've witnessed this disappointment over and over again? And while his focus is primarily on the Catholic Church, and countries which by and large have been affiliated with the Catholic Church and the aftermath of secularization that has happened, my own studies and my own PhD, which I completed in December of this very year, focuses on this question within the Jewish community. Namely, how do religious organizations, religious systems, religious faith structures restore faith following a crisis involving religious leadership? I came to this question from a very personal place, and I discuss this, though I don't discuss it in depth, and I don't plan on doing that here, but there was a rabbi I knew in my own life who I looked up to for a very, very long time, who, due to his behavior, was removed from the position that he served and is no longer functioning as a rabbi. And I remember witnessing this, and I was already older. I was in my early 20s, but I remember thinking about previous ideas that I had heard from this very rabbi. I remember hearing about previous ideas of inspiration and growth. And there's a deep cynicism that can seep into you, that I felt seeping into myself, kind of being witness to such hypocrisy. Underlying Hugh Turpin's theory of secularization is that what reinforces religious behavior is when we see people sacrifice and make great sacrifice on behalf of religious life and religious beliefs. And there is something deeply inspiring and uplifting when we see people lead lives of holiness and greatness, even at great expense to themselves, in order to serve a higher truth. And what his theory basically underlies is that the inverse is also true. What he calls a credibility undermining display. When the credibility of our religious leaders is undermined, when we see something that is hypocritical, it creates a deep-seated cynicism, not just in the primary victims, God forbid, who are subject to the abuse, but to the community that witnessed this. And given the society that we live in today with social media and with reporting, we're all exposed to so much, which doesn't mean to blame the messenger. That doesn't mean that we are, God forbid, advocating that we shouldn't report on this. We shouldn't talk about it. It just means that we need to highlight the effect that this can have on our very religious souls, on our ability to have trust in trust itself, to have faith in faith itself. When you're exposed to so much, to people behaving in a certain way, and the way that it could sometimes be reinforced by the very community that they serve, it can have a cynical, corrosive effect on our very souls. And that's not blaming the effect, because I am a victim of that as well. I did become cynical. I still remain in many ways cynical. But I refuse to live in a world, I refuse to operate in a world where trust and faith itself cannot be apprehended, cannot be grasped. I refuse to live in a world where anybody who has any sense of religious piety must be suspected of being some, terrible, nefarious, malicious creature behind closed doors. I don't want to live in such a world. And that's why we're talking about this, because if you're able to talk about it, if you're able to give an educational approach for how to deal with these issues, you don't have to live in such a world. You know how to operate, you know what to do, you know what signs to look at, you know what intuition to trust. And the more educational reinforcement we have around this subject, the more we're able to talk about it. And not just talk about it in specific, whether it's blogs or websites or podcasts that deal exclusively with this subject, but the more we're able to talk about it in the open and talk about our intuitions and our trust and our boundaries and the way that we look at religious leadership, the way we look at communal leadership in a healthy way, and still be able to grasp and hold on to that faith in religious faith, that faith in religious leadership, I think as a community we will be healthier. When conversations like this only take place behind very closed doors, in whispers, that doesn't serve the educational and, I think, elevated purpose of these conversations itself, which is why I thought on 1840, given the fact that there's so much religious dissonance that can occur from the very witnessing, the very just hearing of these events and what it does for your soul, I thought it was an important subject to speak about here. And I've been exposed to a lot of ugly things in this world. I operate in the Jewish world by and large, and I refuse to look away. I look directly into the ugliness because I want to see it, I want to understand it, because A, it helps me have language to talk about what's ugly and allow myself to still have language to discuss and elevate what is pure and holy. And I think if you don't talk about it in a deliberate, focused, and careful way, your language can get mixed over where anybody who's a rabbi, anybody who has any sense of holiness, you're not able to have that sense of reverence, where the very notion of reverence itself is lost. And I think both can be held together. I think we can look directly into the ugliness. We can look directly into the educational frameworks that we need to protect ourselves and our communities from this type of abuse, but we don't have to allow it to erode into a type of broad and coarse cynicism that undermines our very capacity to feel and experience holiness in ourselves, in our community, and in our religious leaders. So that is why I'm not excited, but I think it's important to have this conversation. And I wanted to actually begin this conversation in a very strange place. We're not going to be talking about any specific incidents of abuse, and that also is very deliberate. I noticed in many ways the conversation that took place in Hollywood surrounding Harvey Weinstein, where when the monster becomes so specific, when all of the ugliness begins to be associated with one specific individual, it can obscure our focus from the enduring ugliness that can creep up in any society and in any community. And when all of the focus turns to one person and one incident, it can obscure our ability to realize that we're still trapped in the room with many monsters, many future monsters, and much enduring ugliness. And for us to just point in one direction and say, we solved it, Harvey Weinstein, and pat ourselves on the back and wipe our hands clean and say the monster is no longer here, is not the right way to approach these issues. We need to understand the very underpinnings that allow these things to emerge. We need to educate ourselves about how to react, God forbid, if we hear of such incidents and events. And finally, we need to know the difference between different forms and sources of power, which is what we're going to be talking about today. The title of this podcast is pretty direct. What happens when you call the police? I thought about including more halachic discourse about whether or not one is supposed to call the police if they are witness, if they are subject to abuse. I decided against that, not because, and I want to make this very clear, the only misconception that I don't want to have is that I am a halachic authority in any sense of the word. I am not, and you should not rely on me. However, it is my understanding from my teachers that if somebody becomes aware of an incident of abuse, you go directly to the police. The analogy that I heard directly from a renowned halachic authority, who I'm not going to name because I don't have his permission, but it's the way that I operate. If, God forbid, somebody is on your lawn with an AK-47 spraying bullets into your living room window, you would not call your Rav before calling 911. And incidents of abuse within our community are exactly the same. There is somebody on our lawn spraying bullets from an AK-47 into our window. Now, these bullets do not kill in the same way that a bullet from a gun does, but the broad effects that such incidents have on our wider community, the actual not only deaths, but physical damage, emotional damage, the enduring damage that it has, the analogy is clear. But I still think that as much as we say this, if we're honest, and I'll be honest, I'll talk for myself for a moment, we still have trouble calling the police. I still see this in all sorts of communities. I'm not pointing to any one community. I don't think it's in any one community. I think we still have trouble calling the police because it is more comfortable, it is more natural, it is more familiar to call people that we know when we know of such incidents rather than getting the police involved. Maybe that has to do with historic feelings that the Jewish community has with state authority. Maybe that has to do with the very serious halachic weight, which the issue of Masira, which means handing somebody over to the police authorities, have been dealt with historically, particularly when we were under unjust governments and had an unjust judicial system. Maybe it has to do with the very fact that I don't know who my local police officer is and I know who my Rav is. and it's more familiar and comfortable. And it's because of that I want to almost make the process of what happens when you call the police a little bit more understandable. This is a very educational series, and the questions that I'm talking about are really just trying to demystify the very notion of what happens when you call the police. And that is why I am so excited, and I am excited, not because of the subject matter, but because of our guest is a friend that goes way, way back, who I know from working. He's somebody who has enlightened me to the world. He used to work on events that I used to run and manage, and he would really schlep chairs. He would move chairs around. He was part of the tech and operations staff. And I remember late at night, we would have conversations about philosophy and economics. And after the first time that he worked for me, maybe the second time he worked for me, and you know the way that the person schlepping the chairs is always seen. It's not always seen as the most intellectual, the most sharpest person in the room. But in this case, through our conversations and after our first event, he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I want to get together. Why don't we continue this conversation?" And we got together and we discussed economic philosophy, and I realized that this is one of the most intelligent people and thoughtful people that I've ever had a conversation with. And that is my dear friend, Aharon Schrieber, who is the Assistant District Attorney who works in the Domestic Violence Bureau. He worked for the Office of the District Attorney in the Bronx County, and he really understands the process of what happens, and he also works within our community, not as an ADA, but he was raised, and the values that he lives with are from our community, which is why I reached out to him, because it's a conversation about communal life, about the very systems and structures of power in our community that we've actually been having for decades. And in many ways, this conversation is a continuation of that, to understand what happens when you call the police. What is the process to demystify that first point of entry in this conversation about abuse within the Jewish community, and better understand how we can be reacting when, God forbid, if God forbid, such incidents come to light for us. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce my conversation with Aharon Schrieber. I am so excited to speak today with somebody who I've known for a very, very long time. Dare I call us the best of friends. We really are near and dear friends. One of the few who's really consistently come to my house for Shabbos, along with his brother, Zach. I'm going to mention Zach, who we love. But it is really a pleasure and privilege to introduce somebody who began, I know him since he was, I think, a teenager, maybe in his early 20s. But somebody who I really wanted to help us understand a very specific question, which we're going to focus on today, which is really just educational, about how reporting of sexual abuse, sexual violence takes place, and to really kind of remove some of the clouds that surround this issue. I know for myself and for others, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce my friend, Aharon Schrieber, who serves as the Assistant District Attorney in the Domestic Violence Bureau for the Bronx County DA. Aharon, what a joy, privilege, and pleasure to welcome you today.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
So let's just say from the outset, does your office know that you are appearing on a Jewish podcast to talk about some pretty serious issues?
Yeah, thanks for starting with that. I did have to go through a number of hurdles with my office to make sure that they were comfortable with me talking on the record about my job and some of the questions we're going to talk about. But I want to make clear that I'm not here in my official capacity as an ADA. I am talking as myself and sharing knowledge and experiences that I've had as an ADA in the Bronx.
I'm just curious, when you came to your office, you had to ask the district attorney of the Bronx, is this okay?
No, that doesn't go up to her. I
didn't go all the way up to the top.
There's a ethics person on staff who I sent an email to with your information and what we're doing here, and she gave me the approval.
Did it take a while, or she was like, this is a good idea?
There were maybe 5 or 6 emails exchanged. She definitely thought it was a good idea, but they just wanted to make sure that all the boxes were checked before for instance, you're not paying me, I don't think.
We haven't discussed that, but no, I don't think I'm paying you.
No.
I'm paying you, I think you are paying me with your wisdom.
Oh, thanks. That's much appreciated.
And maybe this is me calling in a favor. We talk about this all the time. And before, because our listeners, I assume, don't know the ins and outs of the district attorney in the Bronx, let's start with just your credentials aside from being my friend. I don't get your advice, particularly regarding dealing with sexual abuse from just anybody that I am friends with. That's a bad idea. So what are your actual credentials? Where were you educated?
Sure. So I went to Hunter College and then to NYU for law school. I spent the first summer in law school working at an organization called Safe Horizon in the Domestic Violence Law Project, where we, on the civil side of things, helped women in Brooklyn primarily deal with issues of child custody and divorce and abuse in the civil court. I spent my second summer at a law firm, which I did not very much enjoy, but it was a good experience because it taught me that I really did want to go into public service. And then after that, I applied to work at the district attorney's office throughout New York City, and I ended up in the Bronx, where I've been there for about 3.5 years now in the Domestic Violence Bureau.
And it's really incredible work that you're doing. It's interesting for those who know you and your brother, which I assume most of our listeners do not, but you can really tell the difference just from your haircuts. The difference between which of you is working in corporate big law and which of you is working in public service. You probably go into your haircut parlor and you're like, barber, give me the public service DA. Is that how you request your haircuts or not really?
I actually asked for the 1960s hippie haircut, and they gave me this one.
And they delivered on that.
Yeah.
So why on earth, just to understand the path for this, meaning you got a law degree from NYU, you could have worked in big law. I assume you're really bright.
I had that opportunity.
Yeah. Why did you choose public service? What drew you to this? There's a massive salary disparity, I assume. You're not drawn to this for the money. What drew you to this?
Sure. So I have two answers for that. And they actually asked me this during my interview. And I remember that I talked about there being something innate in me that wanted to do it. It's hard to define the same way that anybody who gives up on something more lucrative, it's driven mostly by passion for community service and public service. I've always found there to be a certain joy in helping people and dedicating my time to helping others. But there's that indefinable quality about whatever God gave me that wanted to do this is just, why I get up every day and deal with the issues that I'm dealing with at work.
So let's cut straight to the chase. And I'm going to pose one basic question that I want to understand. And it really comes from a theory of mine. The basic question, and then I'll explain why I think this is the most important question, just for our education as a community, is what happens when you call the police? What happens when you call the police? And the reason why I think this is such an important question is that regardless of what community you are coming from, there's a scariness of inviting people who you don't know, strangers, into your life when you're going through your most vulnerable, traumatic moments. It's much easier to reach out to a rebbe, a rabbi, a friend, a mentor, and it's really scary to call the police when you've been the victim of a crime of sexual abuse, whether that is rape or molestation or domestic violence. There's something very scary about getting the police involved, and there are a lot of misconceptions that I think sometimes get obscured because of the more general halachic, like the legal questions in Jewish law. Is it okay to call the police? Is it not okay? I'm going to almost take it for granted that we do call the police if you have been subject to a violent crime or somebody who is in your immediate family has been subject to a violent crime, sexual crime. The police need to be involved. And what I want to understand and demystify is what exactly happens when you call the police. And I really want to go through this step by step. I am not a lawyer, so I'm going to be asking so many just like dumb, obvious questions that I want you to help clarify. And maybe you could take us at the beginning. God forbid somebody becomes aware of a serious crime involving sexual abuse. Now, again, your expertise and most of what you do is in domestic violence, which is, how would you describe the relationship between domestic violence and sexual abuse? Are they separate bureaus?
Sure. So in the Bronx, and it's different depending upon your jurisdiction, even in New York City, the different boroughs have their own divisions, and then certainly across the country. But in the Bronx, the way it is that we have a special victims division, and then within that division, there are two branches. One is the Child Abuse and Sex Crimes Bureau, and the other is the Domestic Violence Bureau. In the Child Abuse and Sex Crimes, that's where you're dealing with all cases involving minors. and also cases involving sex abuse between strangers or people who are not intimate or romantic partners. In the Domestic Violence Bureau, we're dealing with all crime involving intimate partners. So it's called domestic violence, but it's really more expansive than people that are living together. It involves people who have children together but are no longer married. It involves people who are just dating. It involves former boyfriends and girlfriends or divorced people.
Let me just ask you, God forbid, and I hate to, like, we're talking about, your professional life. I don't know, like,
hit me.
Do you find yourself saying, like, chas v'shalom and God forbid a lot, like, in your work? Like, I feel like in all my questions, like, if chas v'shalom, like...
I say God forbid certainly every day and probably multiple times a day. I remember exactly when I said it today. Yeah, I mean, I say it all the time, and even other people say it, like, not just because I'm the only guy in the office wearing a yarmulke. Like, a lot of people use language like that because it is such a delicate position that we're dealing with that, I don't know, maybe it helps to invoke a higher power for help sometimes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So what I was going to ask you, God forbid, if there is a rape between a relative and, like, let's say an uncle and a niece, but the niece is not a minor. Does that go to the sex crimes or does that go to the domestic violence?
So that would probably go to the Sex Crimes Bureau because we're really dealing with people that are romantic partners.
Gotcha.
Which I would imagine under that circumstance, they would not have been carrying on a romantic partnership independent of whatever sex abuse act happens.
Gotcha. So let's start at the very beginning. Somebody becomes aware of a crime that either happened to them or somebody they know. Do you call 911? Do you email somebody? Do I have to figure out, well, what county am I in? Do I have to find out the Bronx County? What's the first thing that you should be doing?
So just to answer the question about who do you call? So if you call 911, you don't need to know which jurisdiction you're in, which county you're in. That call is going to go directly to whatever operator is. It's going to happen automatically. So you don't need to worry about Googling which number to call if you call 911. But there is a difference between crimes that have just taken place or are currently taking place versus crimes that might have happened sometime in the past. So if a crime is happening in that moment or has just happened, it's easier to call 911 because there are things for the police to do investigatory on scene or perhaps even come during the commission of the crime and stop it and arrest the person that's committing the crime. If something has happened weeks in the past or months in the past, you can go down to your local precinct. You don't need to call 911. You can just go directly to the precinct and explain to them that a crime has happened to you and that you'd like to make a report.
You don't need an appointment for that. You walk up to a desk in your local precinct and say, I want to report a crime.
Yes, especially in New York City, which is where my experience is, if you walk down to the precinct and you say that I'm a victim of a crime, they will have a detective or an officer sit with you and fill out the paperwork, take the initial investigatory steps and get the process started of doing the investigation.
I assume that that's much scarier to walk into a precinct. When you walk into a precinct, I'm just curious, in your experience, what % of your reports are coming from, like, walk-ins?
I would say it's maybe 20% or so. Approximately or so.
Is that what if you call 911 about a past crime from several weeks or months ago, are they going to tell you to walk into the precinct and do it this way?
No, they will send an officer to your home, at least in the Bronx. They will. I don't want to speak for Chicago or whatever, but they will send an officer to your home. But if they know that the event took place a long time ago, it won't come as immediately because they know it's not an ongoing emergency. So it might take longer than if you call up and you say there's a man or a woman in my home that's threatening me. They will send somebody, a top priority, to come by.
Gotcha. And this might take a little bit longer. So
yeah.
You walk in and you're going to file a report. What are the basic information that a report begins with?
What happened to you? They will ask you questions about how do you know this person? Well, first they'll ask you about who you are. They're going to want to take your contact information so that way they know how to contact you. Then they're going to ask you about what happened to you. They're going to ask you follow-up questions and ever-increasing more detail so they can determine or get an expansive understanding of the story.
And who's asking these questions? It's a police officer? It's the person who...
So it depends on the crime. If you are walking down the street and somebody punches you, a patrol officer is going to come. You know, somebody with the Navy uniform, with the sirens and all that. They're going to come down and take that information. If you're in the precinct and you say, I'm the victim of a domestic violence crime, there are domestic violence officers trained to talk to you. If you're the victim of a sex crime, there are trained detectives or other officers that will talk to you about those issues. So depends on the crime exactly who's going to end up talking to you. And these things are fluid, obviously, depending upon how much crime there happens to be during that day and who's available. But generally speaking, in these kinds of more sensitive crimes, there are people who are trained and experienced who know exactly how to talk and what to ask and what details they need to get their investigation started.
So let's pause for a second and talk about the training. What exactly did your training include? Again, are you in the picture yet? At this point, I'm coming in. I either walk in, I call 911. I say a crime has happened, and now I'm talking to an officer who's either the blue uniform. Or what do you guys call them? Do they have like a name? Like officers in blue.
Police officer, patrol officers.
Patrol officer,
boys in blue, all that
boys in blue, or a detective.
Right.
At what point are you getting involved? You are an ADA, which is an acronym for an assistant district attorney. Where are you in all this? You're in the back room. You're smoking a cigarette underneath one of those lights, like doing the.
So actually, this is where Law and Order can be very helpful in understanding the process, because there are these two groups that are part of the law enforcement criminal justice
And let me just say, it's not just Law and Order. You're specifically in Law and Order : SVU.
That is the closest approximation, but that's also far more dramatic than real life.
So tell me, why is it helpful?
So it's helpful in understanding what these two equally but separately important groups or whatever it is. So the police do all the upfront investigatory work generally. When you go down to the precinct, you're not talking to an assistant district attorney. You're talking to a police officer or a detective, somebody from the police department. Those officers conduct the investigation and determine whether there's enough probable cause to make an arrest on an accused person. Only following an arrest, generally speaking, is then the case passed off to an assistant district attorney to prosecute the case in the courtroom then. I say generally speaking because in the special victims world, sometimes ADAs are brought in a little bit earlier to help with the process, because what we don't want are for survivors to have to repeat their story dozens of times to different strangers. So we'd rather have people come in earlier to help with the investigation that the police department usually conducts. That way the survivor is familiar with the person who's ultimately going to be prosecuting the case. So in our world, a lot of times we do combined rape investigations. And I know that in the child abuse division, those ADAs are brought in very early on in order to help with interviewing the child and speaking with them. So that way they get a familiarity up front with the ADA.
So let's just go back. You mentioned something about training, like law school. We've spoke a lot about law school. I feel like I have an understanding of what happens in law school, and law school definitely helps you think through these things. Who taught you to interview with, again, I'm throwing another word, God forbid, a survivor of domestic violence? And how do they train you to do that? What do they tell you to look out for?
So the answer to your question of who trained me, the answer is a lot of it was on-the-job training. But you're starting off with cases where the vulnerability of the survivor is far less traumatic. So when you're talking to somebody about how their boyfriend stole a cell phone, it's a little easier to sort of learn how to talk to somebody about then more sensitive issues, because you're building your skill set.
Oh, they deliberately do that. They started you off on cases. They start you off on cases that are a little bit more manageable.
Yes, exactly. So when you begin in this bureau, you're given cases that are, let's just say, easier to deal with. So you can build up a skill set.
Meaning it's a crime, but a boyfriend who steals a cell phone doesn't require the same emotional dexterity.
Right. It's far less taxing. And if you say something that's a little blunter or with a little less sensitivity, you're not going to really damage somebody's, emotions as much. There's a lot of shadowing of more senior ADAs who, really know what they're doing, and not just know what to ask, but also how to ask these questions, because you're dealing with talking about the worst day of somebody's life. And it's very important that you ask these sensitive questions in ways that are empowering. There are trainings that people go to about trauma-informed interviewing, so that way you are understanding of what people have gone through. And you're not just asking these like checklist questions of, I need to know this, I need to know that, but you're asking questions in a way that's building a relationship while you're getting all the information that you need.
Have you participated in those?
Yeah, we've done a number of trainings. Our bureau does a lot of in-house trainings. There are out of bureau trainings that we are encouraged to attend as well. I attended a cyber crimes training to deal with issues involving like revenge porn where people post things online as a way of either blackmailing or embarrassing their former partners or their current partners even.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to kind of the sequence of events and let's talk about the kinds of questions, especially with domestic violence or with, a sex crime that takes place with people who are familiar with each other. So a lot of times to the outside public, it's just like he said, she said. It's just there are two people, they each have their story. And I guess, there are people who are speculating, he seemed like a good guy. I couldn't, the reaction that a lot of times when you hear somebody get accused of a crime is, I always suspect this. I always knew it was coming. Or on the flip side of, it could never be such and such a person. I could never imagine it. So what questions and evidence are you able to marshal that you're any more informed than your average Joe on the street in figuring out if a crime actually took place?
Right. So I guess the best way to do this is kind of walk you through my process then when a case is given to me. I guess I'll also pick up from where we left off before about when the police do their investigation. Once they have probable cause, which is it's a legal bar that's somewhat hard to define, but once they have the probable cause to make an arrest and they do so, then the case is passed off to the district attorney's office to prosecute the case in the criminal court.
Do you have any say in determining whether or not the bar of probable cause has been reached?
We generally stay away from that.
Okay.
That's an independent question for the police department to determine.
Okay.
The accused person or defendant is then they're arrested, they're brought to the courthouse for an arraignment, which is when the charges that they are being filed against them they're informed of that, and then the judge has the opportunity to either set bail or release the person on their own before trial. Now, the decision on who to charge, that's when the district attorney's office comes in. So initially speaking, we talk to the officers and the victim about what happened and get the general story of a narrative of what took place. You also need to corroborate that. And that's what you're talking about when you're asking, so this person is a community member, and say, never could have been this person. How do we know that this person really did that? It's a difficult question because when things happen behind closed doors and nobody saw it, you don't know. How do you piece together what happened in those shadows? You're looking for photos. You are looking at any medical records, which could include a rape kit. You're looking at potentially text messages that were exchanged that might indicate what happened.
So you take their phone and you go through it?
Sure. We sometimes look at victims' phones if they're comfortable with that, so we can see what text messages that they've shared. There are often people in the home who have heard something. Certainly in apartment buildings, sometimes there are people who have heard stuff on the other side of the wall.
And you'll knock on doors cold?
So not me, but the detectives will do that.
Okay.
As they're looking for more and more evidence.
And what exactly, it's a term I've heard used a lot. Explain to me what a rape kit is.
Sure. So a rape kit it's like a medical investigatory kit that the doctors will swab various sexual areas for DNA evidence. The rape kit won't show you that a rape happened. What a rape kit will show you, let me rephrase that. A rape kit will not show you whether consent was given or not. What the rape kit will show you, and the medical records accompanying it will show you, is whether there is DNA of a male on a woman's body. How much language can I use here? Are you cool with this? Like, it'll show if semen is inside the vagina or around the vagina or on underwear that was worn. And it will show you if there was signs of violent sex, tearing, bleeding, bruising in those areas. Now, it does not tell you that consent wasn't given. Just because there is DNA doesn't mean there's going to be DNA on consensual sex as well. But it will provide you all of the evidence about whether sex actually took place and hopefully, or potentially whether violent sex took place.
Mm-hmm. Now, it seems almost inconceivable that no one wants to prepare, God forbid, of what they would do if they were in this situation. And, in every community, there are examples that people overhear this and that. What advice do you give somebody if they were subject to a crime that took place behind closed doors. There's no video camera. So what should they be gathering in the immediate aftermath to make sure that their ability to prove and to kind of make sure that this perpetrator is behind bars, the moment that they hear of this crime or were party to this crime, they were the victim of such a crime, what's like your quick like checklist, like make sure you have X, Y, and Z at this stage?
So if you are the victim of a rape, and I want to preface this by saying that when you are a victim of a sexual assault, you're not going to be thinking, I need to preserve all this evidence.
For sure not. Yeah.
And so I always feel uncomfortable saying, well, these are the things that you should do, because there's nothing that you should do other than just make sure that you're safe and that you have a safe place to go and that your physical well-being and your emotional well-being are taken care of. It's an act that, you know, it is hard as a man to imagine. And I know that men are victims of sexual abuse as well, but it's hard to imagine how terrible that is. But the things that can be done to preserve evidence, if you have the wherewithal to think of it at the time, is to go to the hospital and make sure that a medical professional has examined your body.
Because the rape kit is administered by the hospital?
Yes. Your body is the evidence.
Do you have to request that when you go to the hospital? Do you know?
I am not 100% sure if you have to request it or that it will be done automatically, because I have not been to the hospital when a rape kit has been administered. But if you request it, it will certainly be done.
Okay.
Taking photos of your body and telling somebody what happened. There's a long-standing law of evidence in American jurisprudence called hearsay. You all know the hearsay rule.
Meaning if hearsay is that I can't introduce to court something that I heard somebody else tell me, because it's
right.
That's hearsay. That's like, I didn't hear it directly. I heard somebody else tell me the facts.
Yeah, and without getting into too deep of why hearsay is unacceptable, it's just generally not accepted as evidence. But there are exceptions to that, and one of those things in New York is called an outcry witness, that when a survivor of sexual abuse tells somebody what happened to them, that person can be used as corroborating evidence of the act because they are the first person to have heard it. And we know that, generally speaking, these acts are not made up, and that when somebody tells somebody else about it, they are speaking the truth.
This is why I specifically wanted to talk about this now and not in reaction to any specific case, because I always feel like the more education you're able to put out there, again, hopefully we never need this, but nothing will prepare someone for the trauma of what we're discussing. But I feel like going through the steps and thinking about what is needed with your exact, and that was so moving what you said before of, you know, the main thing is to make sure that you are safe physically, emotionally, but to be able to have this discussion not in reaction to a specific crime, but almost laying the groundwork for our listeners to think about, well, God forbid, you know, no one plans for this, but to just have a basic educational framework of what's needed to ensure that the criminal justice system can actually operate in the way that it's meant to operate is something I've always not just been curious about, but I've always wanted more of this, just take me through the steps. So you have now, when you go through a rape kit, are you reviewing that, or it's like a binary yes or no? Like there was DNA, there was not DNA.
So the rape kit it's a very lengthy medical report, most of which is charts and graphs, information that I don't quite understand, involving alleles and all these different scientific terms.
Alleles? What's that word you just used?
I think that's part of DNA. I don't know if we have like a biology textbook that we can check.
I'm so embarrassed. Yeah. Okay, I feel like I'm going to get a lot of letters from our listeners. You don't know what alleles are? I
think that there are like 4 strands in DNA, and alleles are, is that?
I know those.
Yeah.
The T.
Maybe this gets cut from the episode.
No. Okay, we'll keep going. So
yeah.
So take.
Oh, but generally, yeah. So to answer your question, there will be in the rape kit report that comes back after it's examined by the folks who do all this work. It will basically tell you whether the DNA of the accused person is a match for the person from the DNA found on the survivor's body.
Gotcha. So there is kind of like a binary.
It's kind of like a binary.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's not always exact, but it's generally a binary.
Now take me back to the arraignment. And my first question is, you know, you have a specific suspect in mind. There's probable cause. He's being arrested and he may get released on bail. What steps are taken? Meaning your introduction, which was, again, so powerful. The main thing is to make sure that this person is safe physically and emotionally. I just reported a crime, God forbid, and there's a chance that this person can be set on bail, like, isn't the number one concern that this perpetrator can now attack the victim again or go after, particularly in domestic violence?
Right.
What do you do to prevent that?
Sure. So in New York State, the law is generally that holding somebody pre-trial is only if you're concerned that they are not going to appear for their court dates. Meaning we assume that a person has a right to be at liberty until they have been convicted of the crime, and therefore we cannot hold them unless we don't believe that they're going to come back for some reason for their court dates. And then there was criminal justice reform passed in 2020 that limited the number of crimes even that were eligible for that evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
Sex crimes are included in that. Violent felonies are included in that. Misdemeanor assaults were no longer included in that.
But even that bar to me sounds pretty low, meaning most people will say, sure, I'll come back for a court date. I may, God forbid, in the interim, like, isn't the victim now terrified? They just singled out this person. What steps can be taken, if any, to protect the victim?
Right. So the first thing is that an order of protection is issued by the court. Now, an order of protection is a court order that mandates that a person, or the accused person, cannot be within they have to stay away from the survivor, from the victim. They can't communicate with them by phone, social media, text message. They can't go back to the home. And so it's designed to make sure that before they're even close enough where another crime could be committed, a survivor can call the police and say, hey, he's at my door.
And what happens if that's violated?
That's a crime. That alone is a crime.
Okay. And that could put this person
back in jail.
Gotcha.
Yes. And courts, because this is a court order that they are violating, courts take that very seriously then as being indicative of whether somebody will follow the next court order of returning to court.
Gotcha.
So if they're not willing to listen to the stay away from the victim order, they might not show up for their court date. And so that tacks on the calculus for whether somebody should be held in on bail.
Okay.
So that's the first thing that the court issues. And that's what the court does to try to make sure that a defendant is going to, not commit another crime. But in terms of protecting victims, there are domestic violence officers that can do home visits and house checks. So they are on a list that helps them, they are reminded this address, they need to go here more often, do home checks on them. And also we try to get people into shelters or safe places where they won't be, where the defendant won't know where they are now, and therefore they can't access them anymore.
I'm just curious because you use both terms. I've been using victim. You use the word survivor. In the office generally, how do you describe someone who has reported a crime involving sexual abuse?
So we actually generally use the term complaining witness, which is a technical term.
It's much more neutral.
It is very neutral, and in some ways it is sort of
deliberately neutral.
Yes, because the job of the district attorney's office is to prosecute these crimes with a sort of, I don't want to say an impersonalness to it,
but an objectivity.
Yeah, an objectivity. That's the word I'm looking for. And so they're called complaining witnesses because legally that is what they are. But I'm using the term survivor here because I think it's important as someone who is maybe the first time somebody listening, this might be the first time they ever heard somebody who works in law enforcement or is listening to an ADA, that they should know that I'm using the word survivor because that is what they are. And they should know that they're cared about.
So let's talk before we get and I'm curious about some of like the court proceedings and maybe, whatever you're able to share about your own experiences. I want to talk about kind of two communal conceptions that I've heard about these kind of accusations and particularly the involvement of police. And I think the main concern is two ways. Number one, there's this concern of you're going to ruin this person's life, meaning, and we're not talking about the victim. I'm talking about communal conceptions, not my own, but, who says that this person isn't making the whole thing up? And you're now going to bring a whole case against this person and totally ruin their reputation. And on the flip side, even just today, I was talking to somebody about the importance of calling police and police involvement in these things, which, again, we'll expand more about that. But somebody says, the police mess up too, and sometimes a real crime has committed, but the bar for being able to prosecute, the bar for being able to prove is so high that they're not going to be able to do anything because you don't have enough evidence in this case. So how do you think about these two things? What do you respond to somebody when they say, you're going to lock up an innocent man, and on the flip side, or woman, or on the flip side, the bar for being able to prove a crime is taken is so high that you're going to miss a lot of real crimes where people are walking out on the street.
Sure. So let me answer the question first about putting an innocent man in jail and having them convicted of a crime. That's everybody's worst nightmare. Nobody wants to be the one who has their conviction overturned because it means that we've stolen somebody's, years of somebody's life away. And there have been a lot of court systems throughout, our civilizations. Even, the Torah has one, Gemara has ones that they've set up. In America, we have a pretty high bar to convict somebody beyond a reasonable doubt. There's some doubt, but it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And proving that in a courthouse is not easy, especially in these kinds of cases where there aren't impartial eyewitnesses to see it, meaning the person who is your main witness is the person who is the victim. And there's always defense attorneys trying to poke holes in the story, discredit them. Sorry, I'm sort of meandering. The best way to think about it is that the system is strong enough that it generally speaking, and there are horrible cases. Cardozo actually has a really good innocence project where they try to overturn cases that have been.
Sure.
And if you listen to the Serial podcast, that's was the home run in thinking about convicting innocent people.
What was the name who started the Innocence Project? He worked in the OJ trial. He was the one who did all the DNA.
Yeah, I can't remember. And DNA evidence has actually been really good in overturning a lot of old cases where there was DNA collected. They didn't know how to test it or things like that. So that DNA has been a godsend in making sure that justice is done on cases. But the general answer to your question is that we take it very seriously. We look for corroborating evidence. Trust but verify is something that is on everybody's mind.
Say that again. Trust
but verify. So you take a victim at their word that this is what happened to them and that their testimony alone is evidence in a courtroom. People always say, there's no evidence. It's just what she said. Well, what she said is evidence itself. But you have to have corroborating evidence as well in order to really hit that high bar on these serious felony cases about what happened.
Well, let's talk a little bit about trust. There was a case that was later made into a Netflix series, but it was a Pulitzer Prize winning report that was created by ProPublica. It was called An Unbelievable Story of Rape. And it's a story about an 18-year-old who was attacked at knife point, and the detectives involved in the story did not believe her. And this person ended up, walking out. It took many, many years to finally, and the coordination of two different offices. I'm just curious, did you ever read this article?
I did. I watched the show maybe 2 months ago, and then I read the article when I was done. I should have done it in reverse, but I took
the article's always better than the Netflix series.
I don't want to call out the Anna Delvey show, whatever that was called on Netflix. I don't know if you watched this thing.
No, I didn't watch it, but I know what you're talking about.
This is the one time I'm really going to say an opinion, just read the article. It's not worth the 9 hours.
It's not worth the 9 hours.
Yeah.
But when you read that as an ADA of that lack of trust,
right, that
this person, this young girl who'd been through a lot, and they blamed it on her tough upbringing and this and that, is that something that you've witnessed, or do you think, or what concrete steps have been taken from what you've seen in the criminal justice system to ensure that kind of stuff doesn't happen?
So I have not seen that personally, where somebody is not believed, but also you have to understand that when a case has come on my desk, an arrest has already been made. And it's important for people to remember that an arrest is not indicative of guilt. Even an indictment is not necessarily indicative of guilt. It's only a conviction at trial that shows that a person is guilty. And you see this all the time where people are arrested and they are not only they're not found guilty, the charges are later dropped because as the investigation goes on, either new evidence comes to light that shows the person's innocence, or the credibility of the accuser is, shown to be they're not credible. So there is a multi-step process here. And there are people who are arrested that are innocent. But the hope is that those are few and far between. And then the real hope is that those people are not convicted at trial. Either the case is dropped before that.
Has that ever happened with you? Have you ever seen, an innocent person get initially arrested and then later on the charges dropped?
Yes, but I want to be clear about this, that I've never seen a case where there was not probable cause to arrest the person. What there has been is after the probable cause was established, which is one bar, the higher bar of beyond a reasonable doubt at trial was not met. Or that there was more evidence that came to light that showed that the police were not aware of at the time, that demonstrated that the accused person was not the person that we were looking for. I've seen, and this is where defense attorneys are really important, because defense attorneys are the prosecutor's chavrusa in pursuing justice. They're our partners. They're our adversaries, but they're ultimately the partners in justice because they're the ones that present the alternative perspective of what happened. They're the ones who care about their client's interests and want to make sure that that person, if they're really innocent, is not going to be convicted. And so I've had defense attorneys send me text messages that definitively show that something didn't happen. I've had defense attorneys show me, credible alibis that this person was not where we had originally thought that they were.
That's so interesting. I love that notion of you are adversaries, but you're both kind of a good defense attorney and a good district attorney are really both trying to arrive at the same conclusion, namely the truth.
Right. Our job is to find the truth. I mean, the mission statement of our bureau is just to prosecute the truth. I've never felt bad about dismissing a case when the evidence showed that that we had the wrong person or that it didn't happen.
Do you personally bring cases to trial?
I have not myself actually conducted a trial, but I have reached the step of we're ready for trial and then people take a plea offer.
Gotcha.
I'm a little jealous of the people who have done trials because I would like to do one, but a lot of times I don't know, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but there's an old saying that if, a really good ADA will never have to try a case because you'll pinpoint the exact offer, right? The exact disposition of justice that a case should have. And then they'll just take the offer because they'll see the evidence and you'll have analyzed the case properly. And then it'll be done because
it won't even have to go to trial.
Right. Because everyone will know the evidence is there. The evidence is not there. This is what the case should be pled out to. And that'll be that.
Gotcha. Let's talk about some of the general cultural barriers. I mean, you really took us through this process, from the initial report, arraignment, and then eventually you go to trial and you try to figure out that, whether you can reach that standard beyond the reasonable doubt. Tell me a little bit about the cultural interactions. I think a big concern, again, coming back to our original question, what happens when you call the police? And I think part of what's initially scary, I've called the police twice because of, traffic, car stuff, nothing. I was involved in a very small hit and run. I actually posed the question to Twitter.
I was about to say, I think I saw that on Twitter once.
Yeah, very sweet, but clearly, confused older woman, sideswiped my car and just clearly she stopped. I told her, you just hit me. And then she drove off, and I got the cops involved. It wasn't all that traumatic. But I think one of the concerns that people have with getting the police involved are the cultural differences between, the specific culture, whether it's in the Orthodox community or any Jewish minority community.
Yeah. Being
able to bridge and translate the cultural idiosyncrasies to the people involved in the case. How have you ever been involved, maybe not specifically in the Orthodox community, have you been involved in these minority communities? How do you make the leap for that cultural divide of understanding their traditions?
So this is one of the great joys of working in New York City, which is that it really is full of diversity and people who are at their core just like anyone else, no matter their dress, their culture, the way they look. We're all looking for the same stuff. And it's been very personally satisfying to sit across the table from somebody who does not look like me or does not believe what I believe. And I've been able to help them. How do you bridge that gap? You bridge it with sensitivity, with showing somebody that you care, with just being I don't want to rely on cliches, but when you are real with somebody and you tell them, I care about you, and maybe nobody's cared about them in their whole life. Maybe even their community doesn't care about them when something horrible has happened to them. If you show them that they care, they will be receptive to that. But then again, I'm also talking from experience of people who have already come forward and they're sitting across me because they are now ready to talk about what happened to them. If you don't trust the police, and there's a lot of reasons why people don't, and that can depend on the community. I think the reason, I don't want to speculate. I think we can all agree.
There are reasons different communities have mistrust of the police. Some of it's historic. I'm sure there are parts where, the stories that you grow up with from generations ago where the police of the local government were discriminatory, were against you. Many minority communities have deep distrust of police because it's historic. Some minority communities have distrust of police because in their local community there was an incident, in recent memory that they felt disappointed. That's a hard thing to repair, but it's important to repair.
And I don't want to talk for any community that's not ours, which is non-Orthodox. I have the sense that people in our community don't go to the police as much as they should. I think that's something you said at the start of this. But you should know that the police care about you, and the district attorneys across the country care about you, and they care about public safety, and they care about your rights and that you're safe. And even if they don't have the cultural language to be able to speak to you yet, they will build that if you come forward. The first person to come forward is going to be the person that starts building the road from our community to the police department. You know, I work in the Bronx. It is not a heavily Jewish community. And so, you know, I'm only one of, I think, just 3 Jews in my bureau. And I believe the only yarmulke wearing person in my whole office. But I know that in Brooklyn, it's I think, a different makeup. And I think they have a better cultural knowledge there because they work with people who live in the Hasidic or Orthodox communities there. And so every office is going to try to tailor themselves to the community that they're serving, whether it's literally staffing people that might understand it or with having institutional knowledge about how to talk to people who are not like them. But New York City is not, you know, New Yorkers know that you're going to interact with people who aren't like you.
Yeah, we're all minorities.
Everyone's a minority in New York. Yeah, and so I
Yeah.
think there's generally an acceptance of people who are not like you, and you shouldn't be afraid to reach out to the police or the district attorney's office to talk, because even if they don't know about Shabbat, Yontif, whatever, they know that a rape is a rape. Doesn't matter who did it. An assault is an assault. Whether it happens, you know, because of our own cultural norms and maybe we have a different sense of what's okay. But if you're a victim, you know it's not okay. And the law knows it's not okay. And the ADAs know that.
So let me ask you this. There was a fantastic distinction that you made. You know, we've discussed this just from knowing each other. We talk about kind of communal landscaping, communal issues. And we're talking about, you know, contrasting the power that a police department, a district attorney's office can wield versus communal power. And you shared with me this notion of hard power versus soft power. I'm wondering if you could kind of highlight, you know, what are the strengths and weaknesses of police involvement and the strengths and weaknesses of kind of communal involvement? You know, usually people look at one or the other. And I think in our previous discussions, you kind of gave me this picture of how they really work together in very important ways.
Yeah, so you mentioned my brother, Zach. He's going to be very upset because I do not remember the name of the essayist that I got this from. But hard power is generally defined by the ability to use force to enforce the law, and soft power is defined by influence to enforce, let's say, community norms. And so, you know, hard power is going to be...
What hard powers do you wield as an ADA?
So as the government, I mean, I'm an agent of the state, of the government, and we wield arrest power, the ability to take away somebody's liberty, the ability to force somebody to go to programming or be monitored. But we have very strict system in place to make sure that we can only wield that power under certain circumstances, i.e., in my capacity, only when a crime has been committed, and then only when proving that the crime has been committed beyond a reasonable doubt in a trial, unless a guilty plea has been reached.
You could subpoena somebody,
right? I have the power to subpoena.
What does that mean, to subpoena?
So a subpoena is it's a document that demands that either a person come to testify in court or that an agency, organization, or company provide documents to our office or to the court for trial.
And if you refuse a subpoena, what happens?
Well, conceivably, you could be arrested or fined.
You can't blow it off.
Not supposed to blow it off. No. You're not supposed to blow off a subpoena. Now, do people not testify when they are subpoenaed? Yes. Are there reasons why we might not enforce it? I don't want to get into it, but there are reasons when sometimes we might not enforce a subpoena.
But that's a hard power. You can force somebody to come and talk to you.
Yes, we have the power of force, generally speaking. That's what governments have. That's hard power.
And that's in contrast to...
Soft power is the power of influence. So in our community, so rabbinic figures have, generally speaking, soft power. They can go up and give a speech, and by the power of their respect... The respect that people give them, they can influence people to do certain things or to change the way that they think about certain things. Now, we have some amount of hard power in the Jewish community. There are beis dins that can put down certain edicts, but generally speaking, the power of beis din actually comes from the ability to enforce beis din's decision in a civil court. right? Based in can't just send out.
Can arrest somebody.
Not that I know of. I don't
Yeah.
know. You might know more about that.
I don't know. You'd have to be pretty controversial to get arrested by
Yeah.
Bezdin.
Right. So you can't force somebody
Yeah.
to. You're not Basin doesn't.
I've never been arrested by Bezdin. I've probably done enough. I'm sure there have been Jewish courts that have wanted to arrest me. That I am pretty certain of. But I've never. No, a Jewish court cannot arrest.
Right.
They can't. They can send out a subpoena, which is known as a hazmana, which is a edict that we want you to appear before us, but because of the competing systems in America and their informality, they're ignored too frequently, unfortunately.
And cherem, which might be the most powerful, is also, if people don't want to enforce a cherem,
it's a little dated cherem. I mean, we don't have that universal cherem where you're, like Spinoza, you're lying down in front of the shul and having people step on you.
Yeah, but even if you think about that, even in olden times, right? If let's say the rest of a community was like, nah, we don't care. What's anybody going to do?
Well, in olden times, this is the distinction. In olden times, Jewish court system derived their power from the state.
Is that how it worked in Europe?
With different places in Europe, but you had state-invested power into Jewish communities where Jewish communities were able to tax.
Oh, I didn't know that.
That was state power. That's for a different discussion.
No, that's cool though. Yeah.
But I love this.
It's the next series. Yeah.
Bad idea. Any rabbinic communal leaders listening to this?
Don't get any ideas, buddy.
Taxed or arrested.
No.
In the near future. But one thing, I mean, the taxing we've spoken about. I mean, that's what makes tuition, cost of living.
You want to do that? No, we could do that too.
Yeah. A little bit of taxing. But this notion of the difference between hard power and soft power, I think it's so important. People miss it because I think a lot of times we accuse hard power institutions for not wielding soft power when they don't have any, meaning you don't have a community that you can, so to speak, inspire and influence.
I'm trying to tonight, though.
Yeah.
I'm trying to wield a little soft power.
Yeah. Do better, be better. Yeah. And I think a lot of times we look at institutions of soft power, communal leaders, and we want them to wield hard power when in truth they don't have. They don't have hard power.
Exactly.
And that confusion, I think, leads to a lot of misconceptions, frustrations, anger, and also injustice, frankly. When you go to a soft institution for something that requires hard power, and when you go to a hard power institution that requires soft power.
And also the institutions themselves not knowing their role.
Correct.
That can be a failing of our community. Soft power institutions not understanding that sometimes the best way to wield that power is to say, I am not the right person to talk to about this, and I will help you, and I will connect you with the right person to talk about this.
Exactly.
And that's what soft power can do. It can direct you to the hard power institutions, or it can influence a change in the way the community has a prism in thinking about these issues.
As somebody who wields hard power, you can subpoena, you can order an arrest. Is that what it's called?
So we generally do not order arrests. The police department does that. We don't order arrests.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It's like the Law and Order drama. We're like, we're going to go arrest him. It's like, I suppose that can happen in certain circumstances. Like you hear about that more at like the federal level where like the system is a little bit different because you don't have like patrol cops at the federal level.
Gotcha.
Right. No one's like manning the streets who's like a federal agent, like walking past the bodega. Like that doesn't really happen.
But you have this hard power. What type of messages do you wish that soft power institutions, and I wish we had other words than hard and soft power, because hard makes it sound more important.
Right, which is not. It's not, because a community without, like, the hope is ultimately that I'm out of a job one day. Like, it'd be great if there was no crime. That would be wonderful. Soft power is always going to need to exist because a community, times change, people need different things, and so the community, that's why it's soft, it's more malleable. Communities have to adjust with that, and you need leadership at the top that can recognize times are changing, we need to adjust our things a little bit differently.
What are some things you wish you heard more from soft power institutions?
I didn't know we were going here. I actually thought about this in the car when I was driving over here, is that I kind of thought about this question where if you phrase it differently than I thought you were going to phrase it. But
how do you think I was going to phrase it?
I thought you were going to say that if I'm a communal leader and somebody tells me that my husband raped me, what should I do?
Okay.
But I think that's basically the question you're asking.
Yes. I'm asking also another question. I want you to answer that question, and then I want you to hear, what are the positive, proactive messages you wish you heard more from soft power institutions? But answer that first question.
You should ask them if they have a safe place to go for the night, and you should say that I will go with you to the police station if you need me to. That's what I would hope that people would do more of. And that doesn't have to be a rabbi, a friend, neighbor, relative. You should Take them at their word.
And the first reaction, and this you said initially when I was asking, like for that checklist, the first reaction is just providing that emotional, physical, making sure that the emotional and physical safety of this person in the immediate is being met.
Right. That's a
priority.
paramount thing.
But what do you wish?
What do I wish was heard more in our
community?
community?
What do you wish that they spoke about more? You're somebody, you see these crimes being committed, you see the difficulty or the process that it requires to prove them. What do you think is in a message that you wish was emphasized that you got to hear more of?
I'll tell you something I wish I heard less of, and it'll lead me to telling you what I wish I heard more of, which is that anytime somebody says, we can't know what happened behind closed doors, I wish that was not said, because we actually can figure it out. Not every minute detail, not the dialogue of what happened and the exact play-by-play, but we can generally, beyond a reasonable doubt, figure out what happened behind closed doors.
That's your job to figure out.
That is literally my job, and I see people do it every single day. And it's difficult and it's emotionally taxing, but it can happen. And so that phrase shouldn't be uttered by people.
Okay.
It's just not true.
And what do you wish you heard more of?
I wish I heard more of believe victims, take them at their word.
I like the phrase you used earlier.
Trust but verify.
Trust but verify.
Trust but verify. That's become, I don't want that to be corrupted into people saying, oh, we trusted them, but we verified and we couldn't figure out based on the verification. Like it shouldn't be taken as just a generalized by rote investigation, a checklist investigation.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who spend their entire day trying to figure out this stuff, trained professionals. So we can't figure out what happened behind closed doors. Just go back. What I wish I hear more of? Trust but verify. Believe victims, but not to the point where you've shifted the burden now and are making an accused person. We have a principle of innocent until proven guilty, but that's a court of law principle, in our communities. We should not just be saying, oh, it's just an accusation. We shouldn't be hearing, oh, she came from a bad home, or, she got kicked out of her high school. I wish there was more promotion of understanding of domestic violence and sexual abuse in our communities. These are really difficult topics.
How would you do that? Meaning, that's kind of what I'm trying to do here.
Sorry, it took me a while to get to the answer. I apologize. There should be trainings, and I think there are, for schools and organizations, but schools as community centers should have trainings for what to look for. I'm not married, so I don't know. But I think as part of chassan and kala classes, it should be taught about, particularly for kala classes, like what is abuse, what is okay. There are things that are not crimes, that are horrible things that happen to partners. Emotional abuse, withholding of money, withholding of time, love, making feeling like you're controlled. Those are all things that are not crimes. It's hard to wield the power of the state to say, oh, you said that they couldn't go on a vacation. That's not a crime. But soft power can teach you how to be a better husband. It can influence you into understanding that this is not okay. Either I should not be accepting this from my partner or somebody who loves me, or I should not be doing this as somebody who's supposed to give love to somebody else.
I love that idea. Soft power, we're calling it that because it's more malleable. It can kind of get into the crevices and the specificity of every, the personality of each community and its norms. And has that ability, as opposed to kind of hard power. It's a little less flexible and has to be a little bit more uniform.
Yeah, it should be a little more. And I mean, just today, I don't want to get into the specifics of it, but gave a very personalized plea offer to somebody based upon the specifics of that case. And so we certainly take that into account, but there's only so much we can do with hard power. It's a limited set of things to utilize that force to do and to utilize it for. Soft power, like you said, can get into the crevices and customize it for communities. The Jewish community can self-govern itself in certain ways that other communities, wouldn't be appropriate for. But that governance can only go so far. There are things that can't ever be tolerated by anybody in any community.
I had a super technical question.
Yeah.
This is going to be dumb. It almost reminds me, we're recording this. This is going to come out for a few weeks, but we're recording.
I know you got 4 more episodes of the other one to go. Intergenerational divergence. That's what we're doing right now? Sorry. I'm an avid listener. Look, I love the show. That's why I'm so honored to be on this, because I listen to your podcast every week.
No, we're recording this the night after this major incident at the Oscars.
Oh, yeah.
Will Smith hit Chris Rock, and I don't know what's going to go on by the time this comes out. But one thing that was interesting to me is that there was this question of pressing charges. And I don't understand this, meaning this was televised to 12 million people, and Chris Rock said, I don't want to press charges. And I'm wondering, like, if the police are walking in the street, or somebody is clear as day, commits a crime, a rape, beats a spouse, and then the police come, and it was on camera, you see a crime was committed. When do we fall back on pressing charges, and when the police just like, there was a crime committed, it doesn't matter if the person wants to press charges or not?
Sure. So it's
a dumb question?
It's not dumb. It's actually, pressing charges is a phrase that I very much dislike, because ultimately the state can do what it wants if it has the evidence to do it.
Meaning, if you have evidence that a rape took place, or a spouse was battered or hurt or injured, or a murder took place, there's no like, oh, we don't want to press charges.
Right. Yeah.
So when do we use that why is that phrase being used?
Pressing, I don't know where it comes from, but usually when you have a crime that involves a victim, you need that person to testify to explain what took place. Even when it's observed by other people, you might need that victim to say, oh, and, the other people can say, we saw Chris Rock get slapped. Only Chris Rock can say, and it hurt. And that's always a necessary part of an assault, is not only the act, but also the result, the pain, the injury. You need the injury as well. But there are times when you can prove that injury without the victim. And the question of whether to go forward in those cases is, we talk about that every day. Especially in domestic violence cases or in child abuse cases, it's a similar, or it could be a similar calculus. You have people who are families, and sometimes spouses do terrible things to one another, and they don't mean it, or the power of forgiveness comes in. And should we wield the power of the state to break up a family by convicting somebody of a crime that they undoubtedly committed, and we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, but should we wield that power?
That's a question that you sometimes...
I would say, daily, somebody in our bureau is asking that question, should we wield this power when a woman or a man does not want us to do so? And
wow.
The answer to that question is very, very case specific. It's a question of whether we believe that future harm will be committed, how hard is that harm, how much worse is it to prosecute somebody and than it might be to let it go?
Sure.
It's not an easy question.
So let me ask you, I have kind of one final question to you about you, and that is, you came into public service, I'm sure very idealistic. You also became very communally involved. And I'm curious how this experience working for a DA has changed you. Have you become more cynical, more idealistic? Has the way that you look at voices in the community, is it with more esteem? Is it differently? How has this changed your very perspective on these issues of now being kind of an insider to this world and privy to the processes that, maybe, people who sit in institutions of soft power don't necessarily understand? So how have you changed from this experience?
Well, I don't know if I always handle... You can kind of tell because I don't know what to say right now, because it's much harder to talk about the vicarious trauma that people receive from working in these kinds of jobs.
Meaning the trauma that you...
Yeah.
Vicarious and being involved with trauma.
Right, exactly. So when you're involved with trauma, you receive a certain amount of trauma.
Sure.
All right, so I think one of the things that people really struggle with about these kinds of cases, especially when you see it happen in the Jewish community, is there's a feeling of helplessness. You're like, oh shoot, this terrible thing happened and I can't do anything. Yeah, I can type on Twitter, I can go to a rally, I can do all these things, and those are like really healthy ways to get involved in hopefully changing our community. But there's a lot of powerless people who want to do something, and I am very, very blessed, and I mean this like so strongly, and this would be my pitch if you want to make less money and be an ADA, I say do it, because you wake up every day and you get to do something about it, and that's really, really cool. And all the other stuff is less important in terms of how it is like just like changed me. You met me when I was like 22?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm older than what I am now because of it. Do I look at people differently? Yeah. How can you not? I think I see things that other people don't. That's not to toot my own horn. You can't. Your prism has changed. You see things in your friends' couples, people who are married. You're like, yeah, something's wrong.
I'm never having you for Shabbos again, that's for sure.
Well, I knew Tova before you, so it's helpful in that regard.
God
but
forbid,
yeah. No, look, this is where I have trouble because I don't know. I don't know if I handle it well all the time.
Gotcha. This has been an absolute privilege and pleasure. I always wrap up my interviews with more rapid-fire questions. It's a hard subject. We're talking about sexual abuse and kind of the criminal justice system. Is there a book you would recommend, either specifically tailored for the Jewish community or just a kind of a way to appreciate how the criminal justice system operates in general that is tailored for the public that you would recommend?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, I listened to your podcast. I knew these questions were coming. And I don't have a good answer, which I'm embarrassed about.
And you knew this was coming.
Knew it was coming, and I didn't do the research on it to find out
God bless you.
Yeah, I know. I didn't understand the assignment. But I think some things you can do is go down to your courthouse. It's public. You can go into a criminal courtroom and just watch and ask the ADAs, like, what's going on. Ask a reporter, might be in the back. Ask them, like, what's going on.
When are they operate every day from?
Yeah. In the Bronx, they're open 9:30 to 5. I mean, it's a little weird because of COVID right now.
And you could just walk right in?
Yeah, these are public courtrooms.
And they're trying these serious cases?
Yeah, you just walk in, sit in the gallery. I mean,
do people do that? It's like Judge Judy, but with actual stakes.
Yeah, you can do it. That was in law school. We had to do it.
Fascinating. Do you know people? Do the ADAs like know the regulars?
No, I mean, there's nobody doing that because like I wouldn't notice even if there was somebody.
Gotcha. Do you know reporters?
I don't know reporters. I mean, I follow reporters on Twitter, but I don't know.
Gotcha.
I don't know anybody.
Or like on your beat, so to speak.
There are people that the more senior ADAs know because they've been around for longer and
Gotcha.
they've been handling the cases that are in the press. Like, thank God I haven't had a case. Well, that's not true. I did have one, but I generally, I'm too junior to generally have cases that the media is reporting on. But the guy down the hall from me his name has been in the paper many times.
Many times.
As a prosecuting
Gotcha.
attorney. But to answer the question, though, I would say go down to the courthouse, see the stuff for your own eyes. And when things are in the paper, read the articles. Like, they put facts in these articles. Don't just like read the headline and be like, oh, some celebrity, like, nah, it didn't happen, I trust him. Or like, oh, there's my neighbor, like, Yeah,
I'm a big believer that I always try to get, depositions, court information.
Yeah, the stuff is all public. Like,
Yeah.
that's what's to read. I mean, if you want to know the makings, like how the sausage is made, like the nuts and bolts of the criminal justice system, like, I don't know. I should have come prepared with an answer for that question. So I apologize to the listening audience.
But experiencing
reading
it. I mean, we've discussed cases where I've downloaded, whether it's deposition transcripts or...
Yeah, I got a few for you.
Yeah.
Not from the Bronx, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, free ones on Pacer or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm sure 1840 is going to have a lovely catalog of stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Can't wait for the reader. Smash that subscribe button.
Yes. My next question, I'm always curious. If somebody gave you a great deal of money.
This one I do have an answer to.
And allowed you to take a sabbatical with no responsibilities whatsoever to go back to school and get a PhD, what do you think the subject and title of that PhD would be?
Right, so I have two answers. One is that if I had to go get the PhD, it would be something involving comparing Star Wars to Judaism, trying to find the parallels, particularly between Moses' arc as a character and Luke Skywalker, and seeing if there's any parallel. I don't know. I haven't investigated this.
I read every page. I mean, that sounds like scholarship. Right now, that's definitely a scholarly desideratum, as they say.
Yeah, I don't even know what that word is, but
it requires scholarly attention.
Yes, it does. I mean, I wrote something last May 4th for May the 4th about the usage of sunsets in Torah and in Star Wars.
I remember that. That's beautiful.
Yeah. I think you retweeted it, actually.
Yeah, always.
Yeah. But what I would actually do with the money is I would go out and make a Twin Peaks style scripted television show about the modern Orthodox Jewish community. That's actually what I would do.
I'd love to.
If that was allowed, I don't know if the money came with the PhD. My dad's going to be so disappointed because my dad's a PhD and I don't. I have a JD.
You have an AD. It's not quite the same.
Yeah.
My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night and what time do you wake up in the morning?
So the wake up time is easier. I always get up at 6:30 during the work week, and on Shabbos and Sunday, generally like 7:30.
That's pretty early.
Yeah, well, I can't sleep. It's a problem.
What time do you go to sleep at night?
That depends. Sometimes I pass out around 9, and sometimes I'm up till like 2. So I don't know what time it is now. This is probably going to be one
It
of
feels
those.
like it's 2, right? Does it feel late?
Yeah, it feels pretty late. It might be only like 9:30. So I don't know when I'm going to fall asleep tonight. We're going to find out in like when I get home.
Aharon Schrieber, what an absolute privilege and pleasure it has been speaking with you today.
Thanks for having me. If I could just say one thing, I know
Please.
you end stuff with that line, but like you're doing a really important public service here, and thank you for using your platform to have me on, and I imagine you're gonna have a few other people on. So thank you for wielding your platform in a way that is so important for our community.
My soft power, whether you yield hard power or soft power, it comes with responsibility. And to be able to use this platform for something educational, specifically talking to a friend, but somebody who's experienced, I think has informed my own outlook, perspective, and I know our listeners. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you and your wisdom. So thank you again, Aharon.
Thank you.
The distinction that will stay with me most from this conversation that I find incredibly insightful, aside from walking through the process of what happens when you call the police, which I happen to think is incredibly important and something that we need demystified and need normalized in a way to be able to do this. So God forbid people within our community who have such issues go to the right place. But the distinction that I find most enlightening in this conversation is the difference between hard power and soft power, and to understand who wields what. I find very often in such conversations that we look to the people who wield soft power and want them to yield hard power. We want them to arrest, we want them to criminalize, we want them to investigate. And very often we go to the people who wield hard power, like the state, like a police department, and want them to step in and wield soft power. And I think what's important, both for advocates and any member in our community, is to know the difference, to make sure that we understand the power of hard power and who wields it and when it needs to be wielded, and perhaps even more importantly, to know the power of soft power and how that should be wielded. Just because you don't have handcuffs and you don't have the ability to subpoena somebody does not mean that you are powerless. We need to make sure that those who wield and have soft power, and perhaps the power that I have in having a dinky little platform or whatever it is, whether it's on Twitter or on 1840, this is a form of soft power. It allows you to influence. It gives you a platform. It gives you ears to have conversations with. This is me wielding my soft power in whatever way that I can. Because on issues like this, silence and not talking about it isn't really an option. And from whatever vantage point, whether it's a family, whether it's a community, to be able to educate and sharpen our ability to confront these problems, so all of the passerbys and secondary victims who witness the way that we do respond to these issues are able to address them more thoughtfully and more effectively. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our friend Dina Emerson. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play in a future episode. That number is 917-720-5629. Once again, that's 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.